Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Happy Friday, Chris, and hello to everyone listening in. I have been staring at my screen since before sunrise because the story today is one of the biggest of the year.
All right, you are basically vibrating with excitement, which tells me whatever dropped overnight is a genuinely big deal, so let's not bury it. What are we talking about today?
DeepSeek, the Chinese lab that rattled Silicon Valley a little over a year ago, has just released a preview of their long-awaited next-generation flagship, which they are calling version 4.
Okay, so a sequel to the model that famously caused the CapEx panic in January last year and sent chip stocks sideways for weeks. Why does the sequel matter more than the original shock?
Because this time, it is not a surprise. The whole industry has been bracing for it. Every incumbent has been pricing it into roadmaps, and somehow the numbers still look genuinely unreasonable.
All right, walk me through the shape of the release before we get into the spicy comparisons. What actually shipped on Hugging Face and through their API earlier today?
2 variants dropped in preview form this morning. The flagship is DeepSeek version 4 Pro, clocking in at 1.6 trillion parameters, which is the largest open-weight model anyone has ever published.
1.6 trillion open weight parameters. That is bigger than Kimi K 2.6 at 1.1 trillion, bigger than the GLM family at 750 billion, and bigger than their own previous generation by nearly 1 trillion parameters.
Correct, and the efficient little sibling is version 4 Flash at 284 billion parameters. It is positioned as the cheap workhorse for high-volume coding and agentic workloads.
284 billion is still a serious model by any historical standard, and I assume both of these ship with the long context window we keep hearing so much about.
Yes, both variants offer a 1 million token context window, which has essentially become table stakes at the frontier. But the efficiency numbers behind that window are what really got my attention this morning.
Okay, long context is not new anymore. Every frontier model advertises 1 million tokens now. What is the efficiency angle that you think the industry is going to fixate on?
In a 1 million token context, version 4 Pro uses only 27% of the single token floating point operations of their previous model, and only 10% of the key value cache size.
Hold on, 10% of the key value cache? The whole reason long context has been so brutally expensive to serve is that the key value cache balloons linearly with sequence length on older architectures.
Exactly. And for Flash, the numbers are even more dramatic. 10% of the floating point operations and just 7% of the key value cache compared to version 3.2 from last year.
So the practical translation is that serving 1 million token conversation on the new model costs something like 1/10 of what it cost on the old model. That is an enormous shift.
It is enormous, and it rewrites the economics that every frontier lab has been quietly telling investors about. Long context has been the high margin lever, and DeepSeek just cut the bill dramatically.
All right, I want to get to pricing because that is usually where DeepSeek twists the knife. Lay out the published numbers so listeners can feel the scale of what just happened.
Flash is priced at 14 cents per million input tokens and 28 cents per million output tokens. According to Simon Willison's review this morning, that is the cheapest small model on the market.
Cheaper than OpenAI's GPT-5.4 Nano, which was supposed to be the new floor for mass market inference. That is a very deliberate strategic shot across the incumbent bow.
Pro is priced at $1.74 per million input and $3.48 per million output, which makes it, again per Willison, the cheapest of the frontier tier models.
So in both tiers, DeepSeek has undercut the competitive floor. That is not just a pricing move. That is a statement that they intend to own the price axis of this entire market.
And remember that the weights are open. Enterprises can download them, fine-tune them, and self-host them on their own hardware. The hosted pricing is really just a convenience offer for the lazy.
Let's talk benchmarks for a second, because price without quality is not actually a story. Where does version 4 Pro actually land against the closed source frontier on the published numbers?
On world knowledge benchmarks, version 4 Pro is only slightly outperformed by Google's Gemini Pro 3.1. That is within a few points on the flagship cognition test that the industry tracks.
That is basically parity with the reigning benchmark champion, which is a striking claim from an open-weight Chinese model. How much of this is self-reported, though, and how much is independently verified?
A lot of it is self-reported in their own paper right now, yes, but Simon Willison has been running independent evaluations all morning, and his top-line take is that this is, quote, almost on the frontier at a fraction of the price.
That is a very measured take from someone who is genuinely skeptical of hype. When Willison says almost on the frontier, that is basically the highest compliment an open weight model can realistically get right now.
DeepSeek also claims that when version 4 Pro Max is allowed to spend extended reasoning tokens, it beats GPT-5.2 and Gemini 3.0 Pro on standard reasoning benchmarks by meaningful margins.
The extended reasoning claim is interesting because that is essentially the same trick OpenAI and Anthropic are using with their thinking models. More compute at inference time buys more quality on hard problems.
Right, and because DeepSeek's per token cost is so low, they can afford to spend far more tokens on reasoning and still come in cheaper than the incumbents. That is a compounding advantage that scales.
Let's pivot to the angle I think matters most for our listeners right now. The release notes specifically highlight that version 4 is optimized for Claude Code, OpenClaw, OpenCode, and CodeBuddy.
That is a deliberate targeting of the agentic coding ecosystem, which is widely considered the highest margin application of AI right now, and where Anthropic and OpenAI have been cleaning up for the past year.
So DeepSeek is not just competing on general benchmarks. They are making a direct run at the one product category that is actually generating meaningful revenue for frontier labs today. That is strategically sharp.
And they are doing it right as SpaceX is reportedly negotiating to buy Cursor for $60 billion, and as Anthropic's Claude Code is printing money. The timing of this release is absolutely not coincidental.
Let me play devil's advocate for a minute, because I want to take the skeptical side seriously. What are the real reasons a Western enterprise might hesitate to adopt this model in production?
The big three reasons are data governance concerns, regulatory uncertainty around Chinese origin models, and the open question of whether DeepSeek's published benchmarks survive third-party scrutiny over the coming weeks and months.
On data governance, the open weight availability actually helps a lot, right? An enterprise can run the model entirely on their own hardware, with no data leaving their environment, which is a genuine compliance win.
Correct, and that is exactly why sovereign AI initiatives in Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia are going to look at this very carefully. They can deploy a near-frontier model without U.S. export exposure whatsoever.
That is a real geopolitical consequence of open weights at this scale. The U.S. cannot easily control who uses this, the way export controls can constrain who uses closed frontier models from OpenAI or Anthropic.
And for what it is worth, the fact that the Chinese government has not restricted DeepSeek from publishing these weights tells you that Beijing increasingly sees open source as a strategic lever, not a liability to manage.
There is an interesting parallel here with Meta's Llama strategy, where open weights were used to commoditize complements. DeepSeek may be playing the same game, but at frontier scale rather than one tier below.
That is a sharp observation. If you commoditize the base model, the value has to live somewhere else. And that benefits anyone selling the picks and shovels around the model, from inference hardware to agent frameworks.
All right, let's zoom out. If you had to pick the single most important takeaway for a busy executive who only has 30 seconds to absorb this story today, what would it be?
The takeaway is that the cost curve of frontier AI just got bent again, this time by an order of magnitude at long context. And the price leader is an open-weight Chinese model available today.
That reframes the entire conversation about what a defensible business model in AI looks like. If the base model is effectively free, the value has to live somewhere else in the stack to sustain margins.
Exactly, and that somewhere else is distribution, vertical integration, proprietary data, and agent orchestration. The frontier labs have been quietly preparing for this for a year, but the clock just accelerated significantly.
What should we be watching for over the next week that will tell us whether this is as big as it looks right now, or whether some of the claims do not hold up under scrutiny?
3 things. Independent benchmark replications from credible labs, real-world latency, and throughput numbers on the hosted API, and whether any major enterprise announces a production deployment within days rather than the usual months.
Laura, this is the kind of story that is going to keep rippling for weeks, and I suspect we will be coming back to it more than once as the picture sharpens and the dust settles.
I agree completely, and I would encourage listeners to actually try Flash through the API today. At 14 cents per million input tokens, it costs essentially nothing to form your own independent opinion.
Fair point. And honestly, that is the most actionable advice we can give. Do not take our word for it. Do not take DeepSeek's word for it. Just run your own evaluation on your own problems.
And if you do, let us know what you find. We love hearing from listeners who actually kick the tires on these tools, because that is where the real signal comes from in this industry.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and we'll be back tomorrow with another story worth your time.